Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to the Unmistakably You Wedding Academy. I am so happy that you are joining me here tonight for this masterclass. I am so passionate about helping people get started with their wedding planning on the right foot because I've been doing this for a long time and I've seen an awful lot of people who have just been struggling to get started and have made some missteps along the way, and who really just if they had had a little bit of guidance getting started in the planning, they could have kind of set up the foundation for that wedding planning house in a really strong way that isn't going to, collapse on you in the future and cause all kinds of havoc with your wedding planning down the road. So, welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you so much for coming tonight. This is going to be a hopefully very helpful, very sort of tangible and actionable workshop where you will get some strategies that you can apply immediately to your wedding planning. I'm assuming that you are probably near the beginning of your plans if you are here at this workshop titled Four Things You Must Do Before Booking a Single Vendor. Now, if of course you're a little bit farther down the road than that, that's okay. There are certainly lots of things in here that will be helpful to anyone at any phase of the wedding planning. But my goal tonight is really to make sure that you leave with four main things that you need to do or talk about or draft or get in place before you do anything else with your planning. So, welcome. Thank you for coming. I am Amy. I own Unmistakably You Boutique Wedding Coordination here in beautiful London, Ontario. I am a wedding planner and an educator, and I'm pretty passionate about helping people, as I said, at any phase of their wedding planning. I've been planning weddings since 2009. I have an amazing team of 8 very passionate coordinators that I am blessed to work with. They are lovely humans and caring, thoughtful people. I have actually a background in music. I am a trombonist by training, which is not something that I do these days. Unfortunately, I just don't have the time. But I do have a bachelor and a master's degree in music, as well as a bachelor of education, which is probably where that passion for education comes in. And I'm certified by the Wedding Planners Institute of Canada. I has started the Wedding Academy to help people like you to get going on the wedding planning and to sort their way through what can be kind of an overwhelming and sometimes very stressful task. So, at any point, I am here. If you need to get in touch with me, there are lots of ways you can contact me. I'll pass those on to you at the end. But hopefully, you're settled in with a nice cup of tea, or maybe my personal favorite, a nice oaky glass of wine. And we are going to, without further delay, get started. So, congratulations, you're engaged. It's so exciting. And I really, really hope that you feel like this lovely couple. Jen and Ian here were just the happiest, sweetest, most in love couple that I think I've ever met. And I sincerely hope that that's how you're feeling as well. Although I do know that the unfortunate reality is that sometimes once you get into the wedding planning, you feel like this. So hopefully that's not you right now. Hopefully you're still in the blissful stage. Hopefully we can keep you there and give you some strategies to help you maintain that bliss throughout the planning process and not be completely stressed out and at the end of your rope. Now, in my years planning weddings, I've kind of come across some stages that I've witnessed in the planning journey. And nobody is really going to tell you that these are the stages. You're not going to find blog posts about it. You're not going to find people talking about these particular stages. But in my experience, this is what happens as you navigate your wedding planning in a lot of cases. First, you get engaged. Oh my gosh, so exciting. You're so over the moon. You just want to tell everyone you've ever met. You're on your phone, you're texting, you're putting it in your stories. You're just so pumped that you cannot wait for everyone to know. And then all of a sudden, the pressure starts. And everyone has an opinion. Why on earth does everyone have an opinion? It's your wedding. And if you're at that point, I'm sure you've experienced it. Your parents all of a sudden have ideas, and your siblings and your friends. And all of a sudden, there's all this pressure to do your wedding a certain way, or to host it at a certain venue, or to invite a certain person. And that pressure can really start to take the excitement out of what was a really, really happy stage in your life. So, the solution, of course, to the pressure when people are asking you questions and trying to get you to make decisions and set a date and pick a venue, the solution is, well, let's get her done. I guess we better jump in. These people are harassing us, and we need to figure out a way to just say, okay, here's the date and here's the venue and here's a little bit about what we're planning. So maybe if we book some things, we'll be able to appease these people who have the opinions and answer their questions. So all of a sudden, you get out of this blissful engagement phase and you jump into, oh my gosh, stress, we better get it planned. We better get it planned. And then the next thing that happens in a lot of cases, and I sincerely hope that this is not you, and if you're aware of this, hopefully we can prevent you from ever getting to this phase, is what I call buyer's remorse. I have over the years sat down with so many couples who have some form of buyer's remorse about some decision, usually that they jumped into without properly laying the groundwork or really thinking about it before they did it. They commit too quickly, and all of a sudden they've booked a venue that is way too expensive for the budget that they're hoping to stick with, or bought a dress that doesn't work with the vision of the overall wedding. And all of a sudden, you're left finding a way to try and make things work. You're stressed, you're overwhelmed, you're trying to cut back in other areas because you overspent by $10,000 on your venue and you're trying to find $10,000 a nickel and a dime at a time. And it's so stressful because your venue is going to be the most expensive part of your wedding in most cases. And if you've committed too quickly without laying the groundwork and without doing the research first, you're going to spend the next 8, 10, 12 months trying to find a way to just make it work. Now, this often leads to a lack of enjoyment. And I can't tell you how many times I've had a couple come in and sit down on my couch in my showroom and I say, "So you're getting married. It's so exciting." And they just say, "Oh, I'm just so stressed. I just want it to be over with." And I never want any of you to get to that point. I really hope that you maintain that same sense of excitement that you had when you first put that ring on your finger or when you first got down on one knee. I hope that that sense of excitement sticks with you right until the wedding day, through the wedding day, and long into your marriage. That is my sincere hope for all of you. And again, that's why I'm here tonight, to try and help you lay that groundwork and set those foundations so that you never get to the point of buyer's remorse or stress and lack of enjoyment. So, how do we avoid those experiences? Well, I have 3 basic tips for you. And the first one, unsurprisingly, is that you need to talk to each other. Communication is so, so important. And we're going to talk about this a fair bit tonight. It's key not only in your marriage, but oh my gosh, so important in your marriage, but during your wedding planning too. You need to talk to each other and be on the same page. You need to recognize that this is your wedding. And I really don't want you to find yourself getting pressured into making decisions that you're not comfortable with. Now, that in a lot of cases is easier said than done. And when I teach my wedding planning kickstart course, we talk a lot about strategies that you can approach your family with if that's where the pressure is coming from, or how to approach your friends, or how to set guidelines and boundaries so that those pressures are controlled and so that you are managing your wedding instead of bowing to everybody else's wishes. The third thing that you can do is come up with a plan and stick to it. And that's essentially what we're talking about tonight. Now, that plan can take a long time to establish and execute and put into place, and sometimes it's about 250 hours. So this is the statistic that is floating around out there in terms of the average number of hours that it takes most couples to plan their own wedding. And if you think about it, that's an astronomical number of hours that you're going to put into doing the research and finding the vendors and making sure that they're the perfect fit and setting up your schedule and making sure that everything flows smoothly. And so again, That's where I come in to hopefully give you some guidance to whittle down that 250 hours and make it seem a little bit more manageable. Maybe we won't shave a whole lot of time off for you if you're not working with a planner throughout the whole process, but at least we can teach you how to break it down into more manageable chunks so that you don't get the stress and the overwhelm that so many couples face. Now, of course, it takes an awful lot of time to plan a wedding, and it also takes an awful lot of money to plan a wedding. Now, if you're having a little bit of sticker shock right now, just take a deep breath, take another sip of that Chardonnay, have some tea, in, out. $29,450. Now, this is actually a stat that is a little bit out of date. This is a 2018 statistic for the average cost of a Canadian wedding. Now, of course, COVID is affecting everything right now, and we don't have any stats for 2020, but most recently, we're in the $30,000 range. Now, this is, of course, an average. You can get married for far less, and you can, of course, get married for far, far more. If you happen to have $500,000 kicking around, of course, that would be a beautiful wedding. But in terms of averages, we're looking somewhere around $30,000. Now let's figure out how to not waste your time or your money, because we both know that in this day and age, those are probably the two most valuable commodities that we have, time and money. And presumably you're here with me today because you don't want to waste either of those. So, what we're going to talk about tonight are what I like to call your 4 steps to sanity. So, first of all, know that you've made a really great choice being here today, and we are going to tackle those 4 things that you need to know before you jump in with both feet and get in over your head. Now, the thing that you need to know about these 4 steps is that they're kind of synchronous. They're not clearly chronological in any way. They all kind of affect each other and work together. And so I can't say do A, then B, then C. What you're going to have to do is kind of figure out how A affects B and then what effect that has on C, and then go back to A and figure out, okay, well, that changes things a little bit. So they are very closely related and each affects the others. And you're going to see why that is as we go through tonight's presentation. So those 4 things that all work together are your priorities, your budget, your guest list, and your planning schedule. Now, the first 3 are more closely linked than the fourth one, which is setting yourself up for success throughout the next 8, 10, 12 months, 24 months, however long you're planning your wedding. But the first 3 things absolutely need to be discussed right at the beginning, and they all affect the outcome of your overall wedding in the end. So, in terms of priorities, you need to make sure absolutely that you and your partner are on the same page. It's going to prevent so much heartache as you go through the planning and you find out that one of you is super committed to one idea while the other person is committed to the exact opposite idea and you didn't hash it out beforehand. It's just like committing to someone to get married in the first place. You want to make sure you've had all of those important conversations before you get engaged. You want to have all of your priority conversations regarding your wedding before you start any of the planning and book any of your vendors. Determining a realistic budget is probably hands down the biggest mistake I see most people making, is that they haven't taken the time or they don't have the skills or the tools to figure out what's really realistic for them at this moment in time, taking into consideration their priorities and their specific guest list. Now, the guest list, of course, affects your budget immensely because, of course, the more guests you have, the higher the budget needs to be. So you need to figure out with your partner what your priorities are, set the parameters for the guest list, talk to your families, maybe your friends, figure out what you're all comfortable with, and then determine a guest list before you do anything, particularly before you book a venue. I've had so many couples who have booked a venue and then realized, actually, we thought we were going to have 80 people, but by the time we sat down and talked to mom and dad, the guest list is 120, and now our venue's not big enough. What do we do? So let's have those conversations first and then prevent the problems that could arise if you jump in too quickly and book that venue right away. Now, the planning schedule is something that you do need to set up right at the beginning, because it's going to be what you refer to throughout your planning to keep you on track and on time and make sure that none of those things slip through the cracks when you get busy or when your priorities are elsewhere or when you're focused on the new puppy that you just got or the new house that you're building. Because everybody knows you never just plan a wedding, right? You always plan a wedding and have a baby, or plan a wedding and move, or plan a wedding and get a puppy. And so things will get busy and you might think, oh, I have ages to plan this wedding. But realistically, I see most vendors booking up a year or sometimes even more in advance. So for you to be able to have your choice of vendors and to get those vendors that are going to meet the priorities that you and your partner have set, you really need to be on top of things and make sure that you set up a realistic schedule that you can stick to. Now, of course, here's my little plug for wedding planners. If you have the means to do it, the very first thing I would do is hire a planner. Now I understand that that's not within everybody's budget. I wish it were. I wish there was some kind of a planning fairy that could just, splash, fairy dust everywhere and everybody would have a planner. If it's within your means, I'm biased clearly, but it's so, so valuable to have a planner who can walk you through all of this stuff. I will absolutely share everything that I can with you, but it can't beat being face to face with a planner one-on-one. If that's doable for you, that should be priority one. Plug over. Now, the first thing that I've got listed here, although this is kind of an ongoing conversation, is that you need to discuss your priorities with your partner. Those priorities are going to center around a couple of big sort of pillars: the vital elements of the day, the style of the wedding, the important vendors, the areas where it's possible to compromise, and then your budget and your guest list. So let's delve into those a little bit more deeply. When you're talking about the vital elements, you're talking about those things that you just can't see your wedding happening without. What is your biggest priority? What is the most important thing that you need to have? Do you need to have amazing food and a very free-flowing open bar? Must you have a dance? And if that's the case currently in these COVID times, just maybe be cognizant of the fact that we don't know what next year looks like. I'm certainly still being very hopeful that we can have dancing again by next year, but just be mindful that if you haven't yet set a date and a dance is really, really high on your priority list, you might try to pick a date a little farther in the future when hopefully things are back to something closer to normal. Is it important to you to have games, lawn games, or even board games, or contests, or trivia? Is it important to you to find a venue that allows you to have both your ceremony and your reception on site? Is it important to you to incorporate any traditions, or is it important to your parents to incorporate any traditions? Which ones and why? So first and foremost, talk to your partner about what the really, really important parts of the wedding are to him or her and what they absolutely can't see having a wedding without. Then you'll want to talk about the style of wedding that you're interested in hosting. Do you want to go traditional, where you have a ceremony, then a cocktail hour, then a dinner, then a dance? Do you want to go a little bit less formal and a little bit more able to mingle for you and your partner and have a cocktail style reception? Do you want to do a Sunday brunch? I had a Sunday brunch wedding and it was phenomenal. I loved it. Do you want to go completely non-traditional? I've done weddings in movie theaters. I've done carnival themed weddings. You could turn your wedding into some kind of an event that's not usually associated with a wedding. And if you're looking for more information about that, check out my blog, because I have a series of 5 blog posts on there called Non-Saturday, Non-Lame Weddings. So I go into lots of detail there about different kinds of weddings that you might think of hosting. You'll also want to discuss with your partner the importance of the different vendors to you. Now, obviously, if food is a priority to you, you're going to want to hire a great caterer or book a venue that's really well known for having great food. Or maybe you want a venue that is just beautiful with crystal chandeliers and opulent furnishings and that kind of thing. Maybe Maybe it's important to you to have a planner. Give me a call. Maybe it's really important to you to have a really thoughtful, kind, personable officiant that will give you a very, very unique and personal ceremony. Maybe photography and videography as your lasting remembrances of the day are going to be really important to you. Do you want to splash out on flowers and decor? Is it important to hire a killer band and have that energy on the dance floor pumping all night? So, talk about the importance of the vendors, which are kind of linked to those vital elements of the day. Make sure that you're on the same page about those. Now, I always kind of liken planning your wedding to buying a house. And if you've done that, you probably made a list of priorities for your realtor and gave that list to the realtor and said, we want 4 bedrooms and an ensuite bathroom and a finished basement and a big backyard. And then your realtor goes out into the realistic world, tries their best to find what they can for you, but ultimately, they find a house that ticks most of the boxes, but maybe it doesn't have an ensuite. But there's a 5th bedroom that maybe down the road you could renovate into an ensuite. So compromises have to be made in life, unless you happen to be a bazillionaire, in which case, more power to you. But you need to talk with your partner about which things you're willing to let go if it means that you get something that's a higher priority. So for me personally, I was more than willing to let transportation go. It was not important to me to have a limo ride on my wedding day. I'm not one of those girls who always imagined, riding to the ceremony in a limo with her bridal party. So we got rid of the limo and we dedicated more money towards our photography because that was really important to my husband and I. So, which elements are compromisable and which elements are absolutely non negotiable? Which elements do you have to have, and what are you willing to give up or modify a little bit to make it work with the other elements of the day? Now, with regard to your guest list, first of all, before you think about specific numbers, do a gut check. Say, "Hey gut, do I want an enormous wedding with everybody I've ever met since childhood? Or would I rather, am I the kind of person who would rather keep it small and a little bit more intimate? Am I uncomfortable with crowds or am I a party animal?" So do that gut check before you even think about the realistic elements of how many people you could have. Think, what do I want if I had a perfect world? And the same thing is going to go for your budget. What does your gut say? Before everybody else starts putting in all of their ideas and their pressures, can you see yourself splashing out tens or maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars on a wedding? Or do you have other priorities in your life right now? Are you saving for a down payment on that first house? Are you working on adopting a child? I don't know what it is, but are there other priorities that you would rather allocate funds to and scale back on the wedding? Or do you want to have a big, splashy, elaborate event that has a zillion guests? So these are the conversations that you need to start with and then come back to as you navigate the rest of the 4 steps that we're going to talk through. Now, when you're talking about priorities, I would suggest that you and your partner make a list. And you might want to do this before you even talk through anything with anyone so that you don't color each other's opinions because you love each other and you want to make each other happy. And we know that we are willing to give up things that we want for the people that we love, and that's great. And I'm certainly not saying that you don't need to compromise to make your partner happy. But what I am saying is that if you make these lists exclusive of each other, you're going to be a little bit more honest about what you actually want rather than letting your opinions be colored by what your partner wants. So let's say partner one ranks their first 3 priorities as amazing food and drink, a really unique venue, and a killer DJ. So that's partner one's list. And then we compare with partner two, who wants a fun party, a host bar, and beautiful flowers. So, what kinds of similarities do we see here? Well, amazing food and drink goes really well with a host bar. So, that's number one for partner one and number two for partner two. So, we're going to assume that that's probably going to be an area where you're going to devote a little bit more of your budget to your catering and your bartending so that you both get that priority that's important to both of you. Now, partner one wants a killer DJ. Partner two wants a fun party, and those are pretty closely linked if you're having any kind of a dance. So again, that's probably going to be a priority for both of you to maybe allocate a little bit more to the DJ budget, and then you'll be assured that you'll get a DJ who's going to give you that killer rocking party. And it probably means that you're not going to dedicate a large chunk of your budget to couture gowns or custom made tuxedos or transportation, Rolls-Royce limos for the entire wedding party. You're probably not going to splash out on cake. You're probably not going to hire the best decorator in town. Now, that doesn't mean you can't have attire, transportation, cake, and decor, but it probably just means that you're going to be a little bit more careful with the decisions that you make there because you're devoting more of your budget to the priorities that are important to you. Now, once you've had that initial discussion about priorities, you're going to kind of balance guest list and budget because they're so closely linked. The higher your guest count, the higher your budget. You are going to spend the lion's share of your budget feeding and providing drink for these folks. And so the more of them you have, obviously, the higher your budget is going to go. Now, I use the word realistic budget because I so strongly believe that you need to know what is actually feasible for you in your life situation at this moment today. And so many couples come to me and they say, yeah, I don't really know what the budget's going to be. We just kind of started booking stuff and we'll see where we end up. And those are the couples who get super uncomfortable by the end of the planning because they realize that they've spent so much more than they ever thought was reasonable on a wedding. But because they never laid it out, they never talked about it, they never wrote it down, the budget got out of hand really, really quickly. So we're going to talk through a couple of methods to decide what actually is realistic. We're going to talk about how to allocate your funds appropriately. And then, of course, tracking your spending is so important as you go through the next number of months prior to your wedding. So, some mistakes that I see couples make commonly with their budget, as I said, not setting a budget first. So, if you commit to a vendor before you establish what's realistic for you to spend on them, it can overextend you really, really fast. I used the example before of the couple who commits to a venue and then finds out that the venue is costing so much that they now have no money for a dress or for a decorator or for transportation. But by that point, deposits have been paid. And as we know, most deposits and retainers are non-refundable. So you can't get out of that contract if you've jumped into it too fast. Not setting priorities is another huge, huge mistake. As you know, I think that's very, very important. It's like buying a house. You need to make a list. You need to figure out what you can live without and what you absolutely have to have. And just a reminder, you do get what you pay for. So as you're creating your budget, you need to think about those priorities and how they're going to affect that budget. The other thing that definitely affects your budget are those little miscellaneous details that a lot of people don't account for. And when I do my wedding planning kickstart, we go through a very comprehensive budget spreadsheet. It's the template that I use when I work with my full coordination clients, and it has line by line absolutely everything in there that you could possibly think of for your wedding. And so often I have couples say to me, "Oh my gosh, I never even thought about the SOCAN fee." That's a music tariff that goes to the composers and the publishers of the music, by the way, and it's usually charged by the venue. And if you've never planned a wedding, you probably wouldn't know to account for that. If you've never planned a wedding, you might not know that most caterers tack on a 15 to 18 to 20% gratuity automatically off the top. So what looks like a $60 per person price all of a sudden is an extra 18 to 20% more than that. And then you add the tax. So you can see how these numbers can get out of control really, really quickly. So working with a comprehensive spreadsheet from the beginning is so important. Now, how do you determine what's realistic for you? There are basically three things that I think you need to talk about. And the first, of course, is your guest count. These things are kind of inextricably linked. So you need to be talking guest count simultaneously with budget. You need to talk with your partner about your guests. But then you also probably need to talk to your parents. If they are at all involved in the planning, whether it's financially or just sort of emotionally invested, chances are pretty good that they're going to have some guests that they're going to want you to invite. And you're going to need to come to a consensus about whether those guests do get invited or whether they don't. You also need to think about your vendors. So don't forget that if you've got vendors who are with you for a substantial portion of the day, your DJ, your photographer, your videographer, your planner, you're going to need to include them in the guest count. Now, vendors won't be drinking in most cases. So if you're looking at a venue that has a beverage package, you're not going to have to pay for that for your vendors. But it is definitely courteous and, in fact, written into most of our contracts that we request a meal at the dinner because we're working for 8 or 10 or 14 hours. And we'd like to keep our blood sugar up. So don't forget to account for that. Now, the second thing you need to talk about are the comfortable contributions of the people who are contributing to the wedding. So first and foremost, if you're paying for any portion of the wedding, what are you comfortable contributing? How much money do you feel good about? How much money do you have in savings? How much money seems like a realistic number to you? If somebody throws out the number 50,000, do you go, or do you go, yeah, okay, I can see spending 50,000 on a wedding. So these are some conversations to have between the two of you. And then also, it's sometimes an uncomfortable conversation, but a necessary one to have with any parents who might also be contributing. It's super uncomfortable, and we as Canadians are so polite. Nobody ever wants to say, so, mom, can you write me a check? How much is that going to be for? It's uncomfortable, but it is a discussion that you have to have, because if you find yourself depending on your parents for $10,000 and they only contribute five, that's a pretty significant shortfall. So you need to make sure that you're thinking about having that uncomfortable conversation with your parents early on in the planning. You also need to think about how much you can realistically save between now and the wedding date. I am never a huge fan of putting things on credit or overextending yourselves, or, basically committing to things that you can't pay for and then just hoping that there are enough envelopes in that cash box at the end of the night to cover it. I'm never a huge fan of overextending yourself that way. So it's a really smart idea to think about how much can you realistically save between now and the wedding date. Maybe you need a little bit of a longer engagement. Maybe you need to, I don't know, go out for dinner less often. Maybe you need to cut back on the cable bill. Whatever it is, where can you save and how much is it realistic for you to save between now and the wedding date? The last thing you need to do is research area costs. Now, this one, take with a grain of salt because it can be really tricky. I just met with a lovely bride the other day who is in this sort of sticker shock phase because she didn't set out a budget early on. She did try to research area costs by asking some of her friends and by kind of, feeling out what she thought other people had spent. But what she found out was that those people didn't have the same priorities as her. They didn't have the same guest list as she did. And she very quickly found that she was doubling and sometimes tripling the budget that they had told her was reasonable because that was what they spent. And whether they were really not sure what they actually spent, or whether they were, undercutting so it didn't sound so pricey, or whether they just honestly didn't spend as much, it doesn't matter. The end point is that she didn't have accurate information, and she found herself very stressed out because she's very much out of her comfort level at this point. So when you're researching your area costs, I would suggest that before you book anything, you just reach out to a few vendors. So if you know that venue is really important to you and you want to get married in a hotel ballroom, reach out to a hotel ballroom and ask them for their packages. If you know that you want to hire the best photographer in town because you want killer photos, reach out to the best photographer in town and figure out what their prices are like. And then from there, you can extrapolate based on percentages of your budget as to what the rest of your wedding could conceivably cost. Other things you can do are to ask around on social platforms. Now, I do caution you because in my experience, some of those social media sites are a little bit unrealistic in terms of the clientele that are sometimes active in the chats. So in a lot of cases, you'll find people who are really looking for the most affordable of everything. And if you're in those swap and sell groups at all, you've seen the chats, the requests for information, looking for an affordable photographer, looking for a cheap photographer, don't want to break the bank on a photographer. So just take that with a grain of salt because sometimes they're not the most realistic sources. You can also talk to your friends who've been married, but as I said, just be cautious that you're not necessarily comparing apples to apples. So just think about what their wedding was like, what you want your wedding to be like, whether your guest counts mesh, and then perhaps your budgets would be similar. Now, in terms of a general budget, of course, it's a very organic thing, and budgets change based on your priorities. So you need to be flexible. You need to create a spreadsheet that works for you. But in terms of a very general overview, you can see from this graph here that the reception is going to take almost 50% of your budget. And by that, I mean venue, food, drink, um, your favors, your entertainment, anything else that goes into the category of reception and creating that party. Your decor, flowers, and rentals will probably come in next, followed by your ceremony, your photo and video, and then your miscellaneous expenses like taxes and permits and that kind of thing. Now, of course, this could dramatically change if you're having a tent wedding because your rentals will be substantially higher. If photo and video are high priorities, then chances are you're going to spend a lot more on those. So of course, take this with a grain of salt, but just for a general sense of where you might come in, this is kind of an average breakdown of what things look like. Now, I keep saying you need to set up a spreadsheet. And when I do my wedding planning kickstart, I share my budget spreadsheet that I work with my full planning clients. It is not magical. There's nothing perfect about it. It is an organic document that needs to be tweaked, and it needs to be personalized, and it needs to be adjusted to match a couple's priorities and expectations. So if you're setting up your budget, you need to set up categories that make sense for you. You can, of course, find all kinds of existing spreadsheets online, and then make them work for you. Don't forget about taxes, licenses, permits, and gratuities, and all of those things that often people overlook when they're initially budgeting and can stack up to an additional 20 to 25% on the end budget. Now, budget, of course, very tightly linked to guest list. So when we're talking about establishing who is invited to your wedding, you need to determine parameters. Again, talk to your parents. And I would suggest that right from this moment, moving forward, you set yourself up with a system to track your addresses, track your RSVPs, meal choices, and all of that information that you're going to need to pull together in the month before the wedding. And if you start on that process and keep it really organized now, you'll thank yourself down the road when it's the month before the wedding and you don't have to worry about pulling all of that together. Now, there are lots of different ways to come to a conclusion about who to invite. You can start with a list of everybody you ever met, and then if that gets out of hand, you can start cutting back. Or you can start with the bare essentials of the people you absolutely must have, and then add on people from there in terms of who you think you might like to have. Now, again, with COVID coming into play these days, your guest list may have to be a little bit fluid. Again, I'm being optimistic and I'm hoping that we can have gatherings of 200, 250 people next year. But if you can't, if you've planned on having 150 people, could you whittle it down to 50 if you had to? What does it look like if gathering restrictions are at 100? So those are tough conversations to have, but they're conversations that you need to have now in anticipation of what might happen next year. Now, there are basically 4 categories of people that you're probably going to end up inviting. And the first and probably most obvious are your families, your parents, grandparents, siblings, their partners. Does it extend to nieces and nephews, or are you going to have no children at your wedding? Are you going to invite your aunts and uncles, your cousins, your second cousins? So again, this is where chatting with your parents comes in handy because they may have strong feelings about inviting great Aunt Marge, whereas you couldn't care less if Great Aunt Marge was there. So conversations are key. Then, of course, there are your friend groups. So your childhood friends, your school friends, and your current social circle. And you need to decide how far that extends. Maybe you set the guideline that if you haven't hung out with that person in the past 6 months or 1 year, they don't get an invite to your wedding. Because ultimately, again, unless you're a bazillionaire, you probably need to draw some guidelines somewhere. You need to make some parameters. So decide where those parameters are and then stick to them. Now, your work friends, close colleagues, do you invite your boss? How close are you to your boss? That's another area where you might need to discuss. And again, that could be affected by the size of your venue or the size of your budget. If you have a very small venue, you might say, hey, work friends, I'm really sorry, but we just don't have the space. And then the last category are going to be your parents' friends. And this can be dependent on your parents' financial contributions. As I mentioned earlier, if they're paying for the wedding, they may feel entitled to invite a bunch of their friends so that they have someone from their social circle to enjoy the evening with. If they're not contributing financially, you probably have a little bit of leverage to say, you know what, mom and dad, you can invite your best friends and that's it. You can't invite your entire bridge club or whatever it is. Now, as I said, you need to set some parameters and you need to stick to them. This is something that I've seen almost every one of my couples experience is that they say no kids at the wedding except for these ones. And then invariably you have people with hurt feelings because why are their kids not invited if those kids are invited? You have to have a conversation about whether or not you're inviting plus ones or allowing guests to invite plus ones. Maybe you need to set some kind of a guideline there. If your best friend Joe hasn't been with his partner for more than 6 months, maybe that partner doesn't get invited. Or if budget and space are not so much of a concern, maybe you want to allow all of your single guests to invite plus ones. So these are things that you need to talk about early on, set those parameters, and then just, it's a hard and fast rule. I'm really sorry, we just don't have the space or the budget or the whatever to invite a plus one for every single guest. Now, I definitely recommend having some kind of a guest tracking spreadsheet. This can be digital, it can be handwritten as long as it's consistently maintained and it's in the same place. Start collecting your mailing addresses early. Even if you're doing a wedding website and you're doing digital invitations, I would absolutely still start collecting those addresses because you need to send thank you cards. We're Canadians, we're polite, we express our gratitude. So make sure that you have those addresses so that you can send out those thank yous after the wedding, even if you're not sending any paper stationery throughout the invitation process. You need to track consistently. And then you need to also keep in mind that you'll have to keep track of dietary concerns. Even if you're having a family style meal or a buffet in the future when buffets are allowed again, you still need to know who's lactose intolerant and who has a shellfish allergy because you're going to need to pass that on to your caterer so that they're cognizant of who to keep far, far away from anything that's come in contact with shellfish. You'll also need to send your caterer, especially if you're having a plated meal, a copy of your seating plan, and the document that I use has that all in the same place. It tracks addresses and dietary restrictions and meal choices and your seating plan, and it automatically calculates how many people are at table 1 and how many are at table 2. So coming up with some kind of a comprehensive guest tracking spreadsheet is going to be so important. Now, the last element, which is a little bit, as I said, separate, is to create a planning schedule, but this still needs to be done at the beginning of your planning. Don't just kind of roll into it and assume that everything will work out. You need to make sure that you lay this out from the beginning, you include everything, you actually make notes in your calendar. If you have an iCal or if you use an old-fashioned calendar, write these things down, set reminders on your phone, and update it regularly. So first of all, you need to make a list or find a list online or somehow come up with a list of every single vendor you're going to need to book. Now, maybe videography isn't important to you, so you don't need to interview videographers. So that doesn't go on your list. Obviously, this gets personalized to fit your priorities and the structure of your day. But you need to put on every vendor and every task you're going to need to complete. And this is probably going to take some time and some research. And again, Wedding Planning Kickstart, I share my Supreme Wedding Planning Timeline, which has all of these things on it. So coming up with some kind of a list right from the get-go is really going to be important. Then you're going to work backwards from your wedding date so that you can backwards design that plan that allows you time for everything. And then finally, put it in your calendar, write it down, set a reminder. And that also applies to reminders for payment schedules. Once you start booking vendors, different vendors will require their second installment or their final payment at different times. And it's really important that you keep track of that as well. Now, your wedding planning is going to follow a bit of a trajectory. It's going to start off pretty busy. And then as you can see from this visual here, it's going to there's a valley in the middle, and then it's going to ramp up again by the end. So things are going to be really busy at the beginning, then there's going to be a lull in the middle, and then it's going to ramp up again as you get into the month before the wedding. So first off, you're going to book your primary vendors. And what I mean by primary vendors are those that can't do another wedding on your day. So photography is a really great example of this, or venue. You need to make sure that you book those primary ones first. Then you move into your secondary vendors, and those are the ones like florists or bakers who can do more than one wedding per day. And then once you've gotten most of those vendors booked, there's going to be a little bit of a lull. And I do caution you not to get complacent. Use that time to get yourself organized, to stay organized, to start some of those little tasks that aren't so time sensitive that you can do at any point, and future you will thank past you for having done those while you weren't so busy when you get to the month before the wedding and you're freaking out. Now, as we get closer to the wedding, of course, you need to send some invitations, but before you do that, you need a fairly solid itinerary in place. You can't put a random ceremony time that isn't related to your photo schedule or your guest's hotel check-in on your invitations. So you need to make sure that your itinerary works with all of your vendors. Now, you don't need to be down to the minute at this point, but you need to have your pillars in place, your ceremony, your cocktail, your dinner, your dance time, so that you can send out your invitations. And then, of course, in the 6 weeks before the wedding, there are so many details to follow up on. So you're going to want to make sure that you are very organized going into that time so that you can follow up with all of those details with all of your vendors and guests. So as I mentioned, this is my Supreme Wedding Planning Timeline. You can come up with your own timeline by consulting online sources. There are tons of them out there. If you look at any of the big wedding moguls like The Knot or Wedding Wire, they're going to have timelines and checklists that are really great resources. The Knot is wonderful. If you create a Knot account, you have access to so many planning tools. And I encourage you to find a schedule, make it work for you, and then stay on top of it. It's going to be winter. You're going to want to put your pajamas on and stick your head under your nice warm comforter and not get out until spring. But if you can, try to keep pushing through the winter, get as much done as you can so that if you're getting married next summer, you're in far better shape by the time we get to the spring. And as I mentioned before, don't forget to add those payment deadlines once you start booking vendors. So those are your 4 pillars. So where do we go from here? Well, we here at Unmistakably You feel very strongly about supporting our couples through the wedding planning process as best we can. So we have a lot of supports for both our clients and our non-clients, because I really do feel that not everyone has the means to work with a wedding planner, and I want to be as supportive as I can to anybody in any situation. So we have a Wedding Planning Simplified Facebook group, which is a private group, but you just ask to be invited into it and I'll let you into it. And there are all kinds of resources in there. We have daily posts and weekly Facebook Lives where I talk about different topics with regard to the planning, and we answer questions. And it's a really great resource if you're just looking for some support along the way. With our day of coordination clients, we're not necessarily as heavily involved in every step of their planning, but we do send out monthly emails for the 12 months prior to the wedding so that they get a list of, hey, you're 6 months out. Have you done A, B, and C yet? If you haven't, here's a blog post we wrote about this, and here's a link to a video we recorded about that. So they're a great resource for couples who are planning their weddings on their own, but we're stepping in at the end to execute their vision on the day. We also host a monthly wedding planning drop-in. Now, this lately has been virtual, of course, because of COVID, but we do have a very cute little space in the Old East Village that we opened on February 29th, right before the universe shut down. So at some point in the future, we will have our drop-ins there again, but until then, they are virtual. They're open to anybody, and it's basically just a Zoom call where I'm more than happy to answer questions and give you a little bit of guidance. Now, if you're looking for a little bit more than that, of course, you can join the Wedding Planning Kickstart, which is the foundational course that goes into infinitely more detail about everything that we've talked about tonight. Of course, the 4 pillars are the same. We've got priorities, guest list, budget, and schedule, but we fundamentally just go into more depth with more explanations and more breakdowns about each of those items. We give you more techniques and strategies and tips for things like, compromises that aren't going to be devastating, strategies for dealing with family pressure, techniques for how to agree on priorities. And then, of course, in my opinion, the real value comes in those done for you templates. I have a priority exercise that you can do with your partner. I have that guest list tracker, the detailed budget spreadsheet, and the Supreme Wedding Planning Timeline, which are done for you. You don't need to spend any time, do any legwork. You can basically plug and play while customizing to your own priorities, of course. Now, for a limited time, we're also actually going to include our Ultimate Wedding Planning Workbook with the Wedding Planning Kickstart. It's 162 pages of downloadable goodness that is literally what I use with my full planning couples. It is organized by category. You can see my color-coded spreadsheet on the bottom right there, and it contains all of my tracking sheets that I write the information from each vendor consult on. So I have 3 different photography templates in there. So as we meet with 3 different photographers, that's where I'm keeping notes on all of the questions that I'm asking, the kinds of payment that they take, how they do their contracts, what their final payment timeline is, that kind of thing, so that you're keeping all of your information in the same place. You're also going to be asking the same questions of all of the vendors. So the questions to ask for every vendor are super helpful because they actually give you the things that you might not think of to ask. I can't tell you how many times I've been in a photography consult and I've said to the photographer, so how do you back up your photos? What happens if your SD card gets corrupted? And the couple goes, oh, I never would have thought of that. But it's a thing, it happens. In real life, it happens. And that's a question that you need to ask that you might not think of as someone who hasn't planned a wedding before. So I give you questions to ask for every vendor, as well as things to think about in each category. So that is included with the Wedding Planning Kickstart. And that course is running again, actually, next week. So we are running that course the last 2 Mondays in November, and then the first 2 in December at 8 o'clock. It will be hosted very similarly live through Zoom. You'll get a link to the recordings afterwards. And as I said, I provide those digital resources for you. They're done for you. You don't have to spend a second of your time researching anything online. And then as an added bonus, we do a live Q&A after every session and then midway through each week so that you always have the support that you need. If you come up against a hurdle or a wall that you can't get across, tune in with me and I'll help you walk through that and talk through it and make sure that we get those solutions in place for you so that you can proceed with your planning and everybody will stay sane doing it. Now, that sounds good, you say. How do I sign up? Well, to be completely honest with you, I broke my website this afternoon. So you're going to email amy@unmistakably.you.com, tell me you want in, and then check your email, and I will hook you up from there. My website is back up and running, but it is not able to take signups at this point. So send me an email, amy@unmistakably.you.com. I would love to see you there. Now, this course is normally $150, but because you have been so gracious to stick with me through this entire masterclass, and because I know you care about your planning or else you wouldn't be here, we are giving it to you for $97, and that includes all of the good stuff that I was just talking about. So if you want in, email amy@unmistakably.you.com. Now, You made it. Congratulations. We're at the end, and I would love to know if you have any questions, if anything surprised you, if there's anything that you're wondering or thinking about or struggling with. So definitely feel free if you have anything that you're wondering, you can unmute yourself, you can take you can put your video back on if you would like. I'd love to help you out. So if there's anything that you're curious about, have at it. I know that sometimes these questions don't necessarily come up until you start having those conversations. So, of course, I've got my contact information here. Amy at unmistakably.you.com and unmistakably.you.com online. So, of course, you can always find me there if there's nothing pressing right now that is making you crazy that you just can't figure out. If it comes up next week or next month, of course, by all means, send me an email. You can find me on social media. You can sign into our Wedding Planning Simplified group. I'm all over the place and happy to help however I can. So again, thank you so much for joining me here tonight. It's been a pleasure to see you, and I hope to talk to you and connect with you again soon. Thanks so much and enjoy the rest of your night. Take care, guys.